The knowledge we had gained from Alistair Finch's ledger cast a dark and heavy pall over Blackwood Manor. The house, which had already been a place of secrets and shadows, now seemed to be saturated with a palpable sense of evil. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind in the eaves, seemed to be a harbinger of doom. We were no longer just visitors. We were prisoners, trapped in a house with a killer who possessed a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. As if to mirror the growing darkness within the manor's walls, the weather took a turn for the worse. The sky, which had been a canvas of pale, watery greys, now grew heavy and bruised, the color of an old wound. A fierce wind began to howl, rattling the window panes and tearing at the ancient trees in the garden. And then the rain began to fall, a cold, driving torrent that lashed against the house with a relentless, furious intensity. The storm had returned, and it had trapped us in its grip. The atmosphere within the manor was one of barely suppressed hysteria. The servants moved about their duties with a furtive, fearful air, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and suspicion. Constable Davies and his men, who had been left to guard the house, were clearly out of their depth. They huddled together in the great hall, their faces pale, their expressions a comical mixture of bravado and sheer panic. They were country policemen, accustomed to dealing with poachers and petty thieves, not with a diabolical killer who murdered with the pollen of a flower. The remaining inhabitants of the manor had retreated into their own private worlds of fear and suspicion. Lady Harrington had locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to anyone. Miss Vance, her face pale and drawn, sat by the fire in the drawing-room, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. And Lord Harrington. Lord Harrington was a man on the brink of complete collapse. I found him in the library, pacing the floor with a frantic, agitated energy that was eerily reminiscent of Holmes in his darkest moods. He was muttering to himself, his voice a low, incoherent stream of words. He seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 24 hours. His face was ashen, his hands trembled, and his eyes were wide with a terror that was so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to have consumed his very soul. "It's the curse," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, rattling sound. "The curse of the crimson bloom. It has come for us all. First Finch, now. Who will be next? Who will be next?" I tried to reason with him, to calm him, but he was beyond the reach of logic. He was a man drowning in his own fear, a prisoner of the dark and terrible history of his family. I gave him a mild sedative from my medical bag, hoping to bring him some measure of peace. But I knew that it was only a temporary solution. The true poison that was killing him was not in his blood, but in his mind. As the evening wore on, the storm grew in intensity. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain beat against the windows with the force of a physical assault. The house seemed to groan and shudder under the onslaught, its ancient timbers protesting against the fury of the elements. And then, in the midst of this cacophony of wind and rain, a new sound was added to the terrible symphony of the night. A crash of thunder, so loud that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, was followed by a sudden plunging darkness. The lights, which had been flickering for some time, went out, plunging the manor into a profound and terrifying blackness. A collective gasp of fear went up from the servants and the policemen in the hall, followed by a series of frantic, panicked cries. And then, from the upper floors of the house came another sound, a scream. It was a high, shrill, terrified scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that cut through the darkness like a knife. It was followed by a heavy, sickening thud, and then a profound and terrible silence. In the chaos that followed, Holmes was a beacon of calm and authority. "Stay where you are," he commanded, his voice cutting through the darkness with a sharp, commanding tone. "Hemlock, bring candles. Watson, with me." I followed him as he bounded up the grand staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. He moved with a swift, certain grace, his senses attuned to the darkness, his mind already working to process the new and terrible event that had just occurred. The scream had come from the direction of the library. We found the door ajar, a thin sliver of pale moonlight from the window, cutting through the inky blackness of the room. And in that pale, ghostly light, we saw him. Lord Harrington was lying on the floor near his desk, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of profound and terrible surprise. A book lay on the floor beside him, its pages splayed open. A glass, half filled with a dark liquid, had fallen from his hand and shattered on the floor, its contents pooling on the dark, polished wood. Hemlock arrived with a candelabra, its flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the wavering, uncertain light, the scene was one of quiet, domestic tragedy. An old sick man, his heart finally giving out under the strain of fear and grief. A natural death, brought on by a weak constitution and a terrible shock. But Holmes was not fooled. He knelt beside the body, his expression one of intense, focused concentration. He did not need to touch the body to know the truth. The faint, almost imperceptible chemical odor that he had detected in the greenhouse was present here as well. A faint, ghostly miasma in the air. "He has been murdered," Holmes said, his voice a low, grim whisper. "The killer has struck again." He pointed to the shattered glass on the floor. "His nightly medicine, I presume," he said. "Poisoned. A simple, yet effective method of delivery. The killer knew of his habits, of his failing health. They have used it to mask their crime, to make a murder look like a natural death." He then took a small vial from his chemical kit and, using a pair of tweezers, carefully collected a sample of the spilled liquid from the floor. He added a few drops of a reagent from another vial, and the liquid in the first vial immediately turned a deep, vibrant blue. "Just as I suspected," he murmured, his voice a low, satisfied hum. "The poison from the crimson bloom. A massive dose. He would have been dead before he hit the floor." The second murder changed everything. It shattered the alibis from the first. The killer was not someone who had merely been in the greenhouse on the night of Finch's death. They were someone with intimate knowledge of the house, of its inhabitants, of their habits and their routines. They were someone with the access and the opportunity to poison Lord Harrington's nightly medicine. The circle of suspicion had narrowed dramatically. The discovery of the second murder sent a wave of panic and paranoia through the house. The servants huddled together, their faces white with fear, their whispers a torrent of terrified speculation. The policemen, who had been so confident just a few hours before, were now looking at each other with a mixture of fear and suspicion. The killer was one of us. They were here, in this house, trapped with us by the storm. The remaining inhabitants of the manor reacted in their own characteristic ways. Miss Vance, upon hearing the news, collapsed into a state of hysterical grief, her sobs echoing through the dark, silent corridors. And Lady Harrington's reaction was the most chilling of all. She appeared at the door of the library, a candle in her hand, her face a mask of cold, unreadable composure. She looked at the body of her husband, at the shattered glass on the floor, at the grim, focused expression on Holmes's face. And then she looked at me, her eyes as cold and as hard as diamonds. "So," she said, her voice a low, venomous whisper, "the curse has claimed another victim. I told you it would. I told you all. But you would not listen." Her words were a direct challenge, a deliberate attempt to deflect suspicion, to muddy the waters with her talk of curses and legends. But Holmes was not to be deterred. He rose to his feet and faced her, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "This was not the work of a curse, my lady," he said, his voice low and steady, yet filled with a terrible, controlled anger. "This was the work of a human hand, a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless killer, a killer who has now murdered 2 innocent men, a killer who is in this house, at this very moment." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the small, terrified group that had gathered at the door of the library. "But I give you my word," he continued, his voice ringing with a new and terrible resolve, "I will not rest until I have exposed this fiend. I will not sleep until I have brought them to justice. They may believe they have committed the perfect crime. They may believe they are safe. But they are wrong. Their time is running out. The game is reaching its end, and I will be the one to deliver the final checkmate." His words hung in the air, a solemn vow, a declaration of war. The storm raged outside, but within the walls of Blackwood Manor, a new and even more terrible storm was brewing. The second victim had fallen, and the hunt for the killer had become a desperate life-or-death struggle. And as I looked at Holmes's face, at the grim, determined set of his jaw, at the fire in his eyes, I knew that he wouldn't fail. He would hunt the killer to the ends of the earth, and he would not rest until the evil that had taken root in this dark and silent house had been exposed and destroyed.